The number where compounding catches fire is not $1 million. It is a lot lower. And most people quit before they ever get there because your brain is wired for linear growth, not exponential. That is the psychological trap. Your brain evolved to understand steady progress. You walk a mile, you see the distance change, you save $100, you see your balance go up by 100. But exponential growth does not work that way. It looks like nothing for a long time, then suddenly everything. And that is exactly why most people give up right before the explosion. Think about how you feel when you check your portfolio after a year of saving. You have put in thousands of dollars, and the balance is maybe a few hundred more. That growth feels like a rounding error. But that growth is the market's first attempt to help you. It is the seed of the avalanche. But your brain does not see a seed, it sees a failure. And that failure feeling is exactly why most people quit before the avalanche starts. There is a classic riddle that illustrates this perfectly. A lily pad in a pond doubles in size every day. On day 30, it covers the entire pond. Question: what day was the pond half covered? Day 29. That means on day 28, it was only a quarter covered. 27, an eighth. For most of those 30 days, the pond looks almost empty. Then, in the last 3 days, it fills the entire pond. The exponential curve does not bend upward until the balance is large enough. The slow phase is mathematically required. If you want to understand how to survive these flat years, make sure you are subscribed. I walk through the real numbers every week, and I want you to be one of the people who makes it to the explosion. Now look at your own savings. The median American 401k balance is about $38,000. You look at that number, you look at the $1 million target, and you feel the gap. But the real fire does not start at $1 million. It starts at a number that is 60 to 70% lower. And the tragedy is that people quit 1 to 2 years before they reach that point because the flat years feel like failure. The lily pad was half covered on day 29, but on day 28 you could have sworn it was a waste of water. Your investments are the same. For years, you contribute, you watch the balance creep up, and it feels like nothing is happening, but you are not seeing the doublings that are building underneath. The invisible decade is where contributions do all the work. The explosion only comes after the base is big enough. The tragedy is that the flat years are mathematically required. You cannot skip them, but you can survive them if you understand what is happening. The problem is that no one explains this to you. The financial industry tells you to save $1 million, but they do not tell you that the first 200,000 will feel like a lifetime of effort. That is why I am showing you this. The real number is lower than you think. So where does the fire actually start? It is not where the internet tells you. Stay with me, and I will show you the exact number and why your brain is the biggest obstacle to reaching it. The engine behind that fire is the S&P 500. Since 1928, the index has returned about 10% per year on average, including reinvested dividends. That's from the NYU Stern dataset, covering nearly 100 years of data. Wars, depressions, crashes, pandemics, through all of it, the average holds. That 10% is not a stock tip, it's the historical record. The S&P 500 is a self-cleaning pool of the largest American companies. When one stumbles, it gets dropped and replaced. That's why the long-term trend is upward. And crucially, that 10% includes dividends, roughly 2% per year on average, which you reinvest to buy more shares. Without dividends, the return would be about 8%. Dividends are the silent engine that turns a good return into a great one. There's a simple way to understand what 10% means for you. The rule of 72. Divide 72 by your annual return, and you get the number of years it takes your money to double. At 10%, 72 divided by 10 is 7.2. So your money doubles roughly every 7.2 years. The exact math is 7.27 years. But the rule gets you close enough. That's the clock ticking. Every 7-ish years, whatever you have in the market doubles in nominal value. Not if the market behaves, if history behaves. And history has behaved this way for almost a century. Take an example, $80,000. At 10%, that becomes $160,000 in about 7 years. That first doubling added $80,000. Then $160,000 becomes $320,000, adds another $160,000. Then $320,000 becomes $640,000, adds $320,000. Then $640,000 becomes $1,280,000, adds $640,000. That last doubling added more than the first 3 doublings combined. First three combined added 80 plus 160 plus 320 equals 560,000. The last one added 640,000. The explosion is not a metaphor, it's arithmetic. Now, think about what that first doubling feels like. You wait 7 years to see your portfolio go from 80,000 to 160,000. You think, that's only $80,000 in 7 years? And you'd be right, but you're missing the point. The first doubling is the smallest, but it's the foundation. Without it, you never get to the second, the third, the fourth. Most people never experience even one doubling because they cash out when the market drops or they get impatient. They don't see that the first doubling is the seed of every subsequent explosion. The financial industry loves to talk about compound interest, but they rarely show you the actual numbers of how the doublings stack. They tell you to save $1 million, but they don't tell you that $80,000 left alone will become $1,280,000 in about 29 years if the historical average holds. That's 4 doublings. So the explosion is real, but it doesn't start at $1 million. It starts much earlier. The $80,000 example shows that the first doubling is small. The second is bigger. The third is bigger still. The fourth is enormous. But you have to survive the first one to get to the second. And the first one is the hardest because it takes the longest to feel like anything is happening. That's the phase where your contributions do all the work and the market seems to do nothing. That's the invisible decade. And that's exactly where the next chapter picks up. The invisible decade is where contributions do all the work and the market seems to do nothing. The median 401k balance from Vanguard's 2025 report is $38,176. The average is $148,153. That gap tells you something. Most people are nowhere near the point where the market is pulling the sled. Half of all savers have less than $38,000. At a 10% return, that balance generates about $3,800 a year. That's a nice dinner out a few times, not a wealth-building force. You look at that number, you look at the $1 million target, and you feel like you're standing still. But you're not standing still. You're in the pre-explosion phase, and the only way out is through. Let's walk through what different portfolio sizes actually feel like in terms of annual growth. A $20,000 portfolio at 10% gives you about $2,000 a year. That's a dinner out a few times, maybe a nice dinner out. You barely notice it. A $100,000 portfolio gives you about $10,000 a year. That's a modest raise. You notice it, but it's still less than what you're probably contributing if you're saving consistently. The typical American household with an employer match contributes somewhere around $20,000 a year total. So at $100,000, the market is handing you $10,000, but you're still putting in twice that. Growth still trails contributions. At $300,000, you get $30,000 a year. That's a second part-time earner. At $700,000, you get $70,000 a year. That starts to feel like a full salary. At $1 million, it's $100,000 a year. But here's the thing. Most people never experience the $300,000 level because they've already quit during the flat years. The Vanguard data also shows that the typical participant has been in their plan for only about 5 to 6 years. That's not long enough to see the first doubling, only long enough to feel the frustration. Most people quit right when the math is about to turn in their favor. Only about 1 in 6 savers has a balance of $250,000 or more. That's the crossing zone. So the vast majority never experience the market pulling the sled. Charlie Munger, the vice chairman of Berkshire Hathaway, understood this struggle better than anyone. He was describing the psychological hurdle of the invisible decade. Most people interpret that quote as meaning that once you hit 100,000, compounding wakes up and starts doing the heavy lifting. But that's not what he said. He was talking about the struggle, the long, boring, flat years where you're putting in the work and the market seems to be doing nothing. He was validating that the invisible decade is real and it's hard, but the actual crossover point where the market's annual contribution exceeds your own is higher. For most savers, it's somewhere between $250,000 and $350,000, depending on how much you save each year. So the real fire doesn't start at $100,000. It starts higher. So the crossover happens at a higher number than the internet tells you. Let me walk you through the actual math. Take a $300,000 portfolio earning a 10% return. That portfolio generates $30,000 in growth in the first year alone. Now, compare that to what you can save. The typical American household contributes about 12% of their salary. On an $80,000 income, that employee contribution is roughly $9,600. Add in a typical employer match of around $10,000, and your total annual savings sits around $20,000. So at $300,000, the market is handing you $30,000 a year. That's $10,000 more than you're putting in. The market becomes the senior partner. Your contributions are now the junior partner. That's the crossover point where compounding catches fire. And depending on your exact savings rate, that number lands somewhere between $250,000 and $350,000. Not $100,000, not $1 million. That's the real number. Now here's the problem. At $100,000, you're earning $10,000 a year in growth, but you're still contributing $20,000 from your paycheck. The market is still a junior partner. The feel-good narrative that $100,000 is where everything accelerates is misleading. It's not the crossover. It's just the beginning of the visible phase. The real shift happens when the market's contribution surpasses your own, and that requires a bigger base. The Vanguard data shows that only about 16% of savers ever reach a balance of $250,000 or more, fewer than 1 in 6. That means the vast majority of people never feel the snowball start to roll. They're still pushing it uphill, and they quit before the hill flattens. Why do they quit? Because of the brain problem. Let me show you what that looks like. You start saving $500 a month. You put that into a diversified portfolio, earning the historical average. After 7 years, you have about $60,000 to $65,000. You've been doing this for 7 years. You skipped the restaurant dinners, drove the old car, said no to the weekend trips, and your balance is 60 grand. Your brain does the math. 7 years of sacrifice for $60,000? I could have saved that in a year and a half without any market risk. So you pull the plug. You stop contributing, or you cash out and do something else. But here's the kicker. At that same rate, you would hit $100,000 around year 9 or 10. That first doubling from $50,000 to $100,000 accelerates your annual growth from about $10,000 to roughly $20,000. But you quit in year 7 or 8 right before the bend. The Vanguard data confirms this. The typical participant has been in their plan for only 5 to 6 years. Most people quit during or just before the inflection. They don't see the first doubling because they're gone. Think about what that feels like. You're standing at the bottom of the exponential curve, and the line is almost flat. You check your balance every month, and the growth is a few $100s. Your brain interprets that as failure because it doesn't match the smooth upward slope of a linear goal. But the curve is working. It's that the flat part is mathematically required. The first doubling is the smallest, and the last is the largest. The only way to get to the last is to survive the first. The voice is loudest right before the bend. This is the moment where most people give up. The flat years feel like failure, but they're mathematically required. The only way out is through. But there is a framework that helps you stay on track. Here's the part that never makes it into a retirement calculator. Knowing the crossover number, the point where your portfolio's annual growth exceeds your contributions, is one thing. Building a system to survive the flat years and avoid the traps that destroy your progress is another. The math is straightforward, but the psychology is brutal. That's why I built something called the Exit Code, a digital book that distills 50 years of actual retirement data into a mathematical framework for exiting the rat race. 2 elements from that book connect directly to where you are right now. The first is the dynamic withdrawal method, which replaces the 4% trap. That rule was designed for a 30-year retirement starting at 65, but it breaks down if you hit a bad sequence of returns early. The dynamic method adjusts your withdrawals based on market conditions, so you never drain your portfolio at the wrong time. The second is what I call the $14,000 invisible bill, the insurance gap that destroys retirees under 65. Healthcare costs before Medicare can eat your entire crossover gains before you even feel them. The Exit Code covers both, and it's available for less than a dinner out through the link in the description. So you know the crossover number. Now let's talk about what happens after you reach it. Margaret is 45 years old. She has $80,000 saved. She looks at articles about the $1 million target, watches the Vanguard data, and feels like she missed her shot. She started late, didn't save aggressively in her 20s, and now she's staring at a number that feels like a rounding error compared to what she thinks she needs. But here's what Margaret is not seeing. She is 4 doublings away from $1.28 million. At the historical 10% return, her $80,000 becomes $160,000 in about 7 years. Then $320,000, then $640,000. Then $1,280,000. That last doubling from $640,000 to $1.28 million adds $640,000, more than she saved in her entire career, more than she could ever contribute from her paycheck. The first doubling added $80,000, which felt small. The second added $160,000, bigger. The third added $320,000. The fourth adds $640,000. The last jump is larger than the sum of all the previous doublings combined. Margaret is not behind. She is standing on the launch pad, and the launch pad is the same for you, no matter what your balance is right now. Now here is the reframe that changes everything. Stop counting your dollars. Count your doublings. If you have $250,000, you are 2 doublings from $1 million. At $125,000, you are 3 doublings away. At $62,000, you are 4. The goal is not $1 million. It is your next double. Each doubling takes about 7 years, but the later ones add so much more that the total time to $1 million is actually shorter than you think. The exponential curve does not care about the starting point. It cares about the number of doublings you let it run. A 25-year-old with $20,000 can get to $1 million in about 8 doublings, roughly 56 years. But a 45-year-old with $100,000 is only 4 doublings from $1 million, about 29 years. The older you are, the fewer doublings you need because the base is larger. The explosion is real, but it only happens if you let the clock keep ticking. You might be thinking, what if the market does not cooperate? What if you hit a bad decade? That is a fair question. The 10% is a long-term average, not a guarantee. There were decades like the 2000s where the S&P 500 actually lost money over a full 10-year stretch. But the history shows that every crash has been erased by subsequent doublings. The people who got the explosion are the ones who stayed put through the crashes. They did not sell at the bottom. They kept contributing. They let the doublings stack. The explosion does not happen if you interrupt the flat years. You have to survive the boring part. But the 10% return that drives all those doublings is a long-term average, not a smooth annual payment. The market does not give you exactly 7.2% every year and call it done. It gives you a 30% gain one year, a 15% loss the next, and then a flat year where you question everything. The average is 10%, but the path to that average is lumpy, unpredictable, and psychologically brutal. Consider the lost decade. From January 1st, 2000 to December 31st, 2009, the S&P 500's total return, including reinvested dividends, was negative 0.95% annualized. That means over 10 full years, your portfolio would have lost money in nominal terms, and even worse after accounting for inflation. That was only the second time since the 1920s that a full decade produced a negative total return. The other was the 1930s. So it is rare, but it happens. And it happens to people who are in the middle of the invisible decade, who have been saving and believing and watching the numbers go nowhere. You can imagine the psychological toll. You save for 10 years, you follow the advice, you reinvest dividends, and at the end, you have less than you started. Your brain says this system is broken, but the people who stayed in, who kept contributing through the crash, who did not panic sell in 2008, who kept buying at lower prices, those people saw their portfolios recover and then double. The recovery from the lost decade was strong. The S&P 500 returned over 15% annualized from 2009 through 2019. The people who quit in 2008 missed that entire rebound. The people who stayed put experienced the full compounding effect. The crash was a discount, not a disaster, but only if you had the stomach to hold on. Now, there is another layer you need to understand. The 10% is nominal. It is not adjusted for inflation. Your real return, the actual increase in purchasing power, is lower. Since 1928, the inflation-adjusted annual return of the S&P 500 has been about 6.8%. That means your money's real purchasing power doubles roughly every 10.6 years, not every 7.2. So the explosion you see in nominal dollars is partially eaten by inflation. $1 million in 20 years will not buy what $1 million buys today. That is why you need to think in real terms, not just nominal. The crossover point, where your portfolio's growth exceeds your contributions, that is real, but it takes longer to feel in purchasing power. But here is the thing, the lumps are expected. You might hit a double right before a crash and watch it stall for years. That is not a strategy failure. It is how averages pay out. The people who win are the ones who expected the lumps and stayed put. They did not time the market. They did not try to get out before the crash and back in after. They kept contributing, kept reinvesting dividends, and let the doubling stack. Every crash in history has been erased by subsequent doublings. The 2008 crash dropped the market over 50%. By 2013, it had recovered. By 2019, it had more than doubled from the peak before the crash. The explosion does not happen if you interrupt the flat years. You have to survive the boring part. The temptation to quit is strongest right when the math is about to turn. The lumps are expected, but the temptation to quit is real. It takes a different kind of discipline to survive them. The discipline is not about raw willpower. It's about understanding that the voice telling you to quit is loudest right before the bend. Consider the saver putting away $500 a month. After 7 years, they have around $60,000 to $70,000. Their brain processes that as 7 years of sacrifice for a number that feels like pocket change. They quit 1 to 2 years before the first doubling, before that balance reaches 100,000 and the annual growth jumps from 6,000 to 10,000. That year 9 or 10 is where the invisible decade starts to tip. But most people never see it because they stopped contributing at year 7. Here's a comparison that makes the truth undeniable. Picture 2 people. One starts saving $5,000 a year at age 25. She does that for exactly 10 years, then stops completely. Her total contribution is $50,000. The other starts at 35, saves the same $5,000 every year for 30 years until he is 65. His total contribution is $150,000. At age 65, assuming the historical 10% nominal return, the first person has more money. Her $50,000 had 30 extra years to compound. Her early dollars doubled roughly 4 more times than his later dollars. The flat years of her 20s and early 30s, when the balance was tiny and the growth felt invisible, were actually the most powerful years of her investing life. She contributed less, but she started earlier, and that time gap could never be closed by throwing more money at it. Time beats size. Time beats timing. The only thing that beats time is starting earlier, and you cannot go back. So the flat years are not a weakness, they are the engine. The first doubling is the hardest because it takes the longest, but it is also the only one that unlocks the rest. Without that first double, you never get to the second, the third, the fourth. The explosion only happens if you let the first one happen, and that requires enduring the period where nothing seems to be happening. Now here is the reframe that changes everything. Stop staring at the $1 million target. That number is too far away, and your brain interprets the gap as failure. Instead, ask yourself how many doublings you have left. The real number is not the million. It is your next doubling. Once you understand that, the flat years become a countdown, not a failure. Lazy investing built more fortune than crypto memes, so stop staring at the million. Look at your balance and ask yourself, how many doublings are left? Then protect those doublings. The fire is closer than you think. Number is not the million, it is your next doubling. Once you understand that, the flat years become a countdown, not a failure. Lazy investing built more fortune than crypto memes, so stop staring at the million. Look at your balance and ask yourself, how many doublings are left? Then protect those doublings. The fire is closer than you think.